John Adams is America's most performed living composer. According to the New Yorker magazine, he's the man who took the agony out of modern music. But he's also one of the most controversial composers alive. His 1991 work, The Death of Klinghoffer, now made into a film, is the most contentious opera written in over a century. Based on the hijacking of a cruise liner by Palestinian terrorists, it tested the limits of what opera could explore. For some, it exceeded them. Bomb threats were made at its premiere, and after September 11th, The Death of Klinghoffer was denounced in Adams's own country as anti-American. Adams's most recent opera, El Niño, a nativity story with a modern twist, was premiered in Paris in December 2000. It's the fourth time he's worked with director Peter Sellers, who first asked him to write an opera. But Adams was an unlikely composer for the musical stage.
I hated opera and I never went. In fact, I rarely go even now, and it's sort of ironic that, you know, for a lot of people, I'm only known as an opera composer.
John was writing dramatic music. I mean, there are a lot of amazing composers alive now who are writing, you know, all kinds of really interesting music, but most of it isn't that dramatic. It has other qualities, but in terms of the building of tension and release, you know, that is just part of drama, John is one of the few composers who does that, you know, and does it naturally as part of his language. It is his vocabulary.
Adams's first opera was Nixon in China. Premiered in 1987, it breathed new life back into opera and reawakened its ability to challenge and provoke.
We began to work on a genre of opera that did engage with issues on people's minds. You know, and that's really, really important, that opera has this urgency and it's about things that we all need to talk about.
John Adams turned out to be the ideal candidate to revitalize modern opera. Not only was he prepared to tackle the most controversial subjects, his own musical journey as a composer has taken him from the narrow emotional range of the avant-garde towards an all-embracing musical style which can express the most powerful of emotions.
When I started composing, I wanted to find a way that there was a real flavor, a kind of succulence to the harmony that had ambiguity, that had color, that had unpredictability, and yet at the same time it was orally attractive, you know, that felt good in the ear. And, you know, that, in a sense, has been the major voyage of discovery for me as a composer. I like what's ethnic about certain pieces of art, and I like, you know, the American ethnicity of my own music. Certainly my loose filter, what I call my loose filter, that is my willingness to sort of bring anything that I experience in, whether it's, you know, Debussy or Chuck Berry or gamelan music or, you know, jazz, folk, Latin American.
John Adams was born in Massachusetts in 1947. He spent his first 24 years living in New England. Its history, its culture, and its religious traditions still infuse his music.
I grew up in a musical family. My father was a very good amateur clarinet player, and that was the instrument that I heard in the house when I was a child, and I wanted to play it. And I started learning it from an early age. So my relationship with my father and with music in general is very much bound up into this, in the sound of the clarinet in my mind. Interestingly enough, I didn't write a work for clarinet until after my father died, and I think that my relationship with him, both on a sentimental level and also on a level of wit and the kind of humor that we exchanged, and my memories of playing in local bands and orchestras with him all came together into this piece. My mother had the real talent. She had a natural ability. She was very dramatic on the stage. She liked to act in local productions of Rodgers and Hammerstein. And she had an unfortunate combination of very weak powers of reading music and an extremely loud voice. So when she derailed, it was a sort of a public event in the town where I lived, which happened a lot. But maybe that drew my interest to opera. I don't know. Maybe later in life. I began to play clarinet in a local orchestra sponsored by the State Mental Hospital. So if you can imagine an audience of 500 or so severely disturbed mental patients listening to a really bad community orchestra whacking through the Unfinished Symphony or selections from Oklahoma, and tears rolling down their faces. It was a very alarming and very profoundly affecting thing for a 10-year-old aspiring composer. And I think that I've always brought that memory with me throughout life, because for me, music is really fundamentally a communicative activity. And that may seem like, well, duh. But in fact, while I was in college during the 60s, music seemed to be more a research activity.
While Adams was a student at Harvard, the music faculty was enthralled to the highly intellectualized avant-garde tradition of Schoenberg, Berg, and Webern.
I thought Webern was the stingiest musical experience I'd ever encountered in my life. That, even when Webern was played in a really booming concert hall, everything felt, like, here's an E flat, spend it well, And I just didn't, I like much more generous approach towards pitches and sounds and gestures. I've always imagined that 200, 300, 500, 1,000 years from now, the people will look back at the era of Schoenberg and Stockhausen and Berio and Boulez and Elliott Carter as a very strange aberration in sort of the current of musical evolution. That there was a period back in the 20th century when composers aggressively destroyed the pulse. That they took any sense of pulse out of the music, and at the same time, many of them aggressively destroyed the tonal syntax of music. And of course, that was what I inherited as a student. I found myself going to the seminar room and being given the most grim view of what music was about. And then I walked out into the fresh air and heard Jimi Hendrix. It was the mid to late 60s, so flower generation and psychedelic drugs and the whole sea change that happened in the 60s. And then, of course, there was all this wonderful popular music. But I think that in the music department at Harvard, there was a desperate attempt to keep business as usual. It seemed to me that there was something far deeper from my identity as an American musician that was being kind of aggressively blocked out. I got in a car and drove to California.
In flight from the arid contemporary music practiced at Harvard, Adams settled in San Francisco in 1971.
I was very confused, and the first year that I was in California, I didn't do any music at all. I worked part of the year in a warehouse on the waterfront in Oakland, and the other part of the year as a person who went around and cleaned rooms in an apartment building. And I truly was very lost, had no idea what I wanted to do. I was heavily under the influence of John Cage, not so much from a musical point of view, but certainly from a philosophical point of view.
In the work of Cage, a musical direction might be decided by the toss of a coin and a reading from the I Ching. His most notorious piece, 4 minutes 33 seconds, contained no music, as conventionally understood, whatsoever.
It was a lot of fun, but, you know, there was a voice in the back of my ear saying, John Cage is a wonderful citizen, but there was just a really important, serious depth of emotional experience that was just simply inaccessible to that kind of music. But then I took a trip to Florence, and I went at a very impressionable time. It was right at the period when I had just become very frustrated and disillusioned with avant-garde music. When I was in Florence, I got this tremendous, almost giddy sense of pleasure from looking at the beautiful architecture. What I noticed was the tremendous pleasure that they took in the repetition of patterns. That beautiful, graceful, expressive, large structures were made out of the periodic repetition of small identifiable cells. And that seemed to suggest a musical language.
Much the same idea was being put into practice in the 1970s American movement of minimalism, led by composers like Steve Reich and Philip Glass.
I think the major exposure I had was in 1974. I actually attended a performance of Steve Reich's drumming, which was performed in San Francisco, and I was very affected by that. And I think that probably, you know, was a major event for me.
Adams's first mature works as a composer were firmly in the minimalist idiom, but not for long.
People at that point expected a minimalist piece to be a single idea, you know, that it would be a machine that would set up and it would go, and there would be very, very gradual evolutions of timbre and pulse and harmony. And then I brought out a piece that was predicated upon minimalist technique, but in which there were violent changes, you know, sudden, shocking explosions of amplitude, of shifts of energy. The thing about minimalism is that it's very pristine, almost chaste form of musical expression. And I came in and you know, kind of, as one critic said, corrupted a perfectly decent contemporary style. I loved the language of minimalism, and I love those early pieces, but I mean, I felt early on that it was a very limited emotional experience, that it was very attractive and very exciting, but that the bandwidth, the emotional bandwidth was very small. So I tried to stretch it. Actually, I tried from the very first pieces of mine to stretch that. And then I remember, you know, going quite far afield harmonically, particularly in a piece like the Chamber Symphony. I was studying a score to Schoenberg's Chamber Symphony in one room, and my son, who was very young at the time, was watching cartoons on television in another room, and I heard the cartoon music, and in my head I heard the Schoenberg, and they seemed to have a very, very bizarre affinity, and so hence was born my Chamber Symphony. Mongreliers is the title of the first movement of the Chamber Symphony. It was just an aggressively cheeky idea of mine to respond to some critic, I can't remember, who complained that my music lacked breeding.
Perhaps one reason why people like John's music is that there is this underlying groove which unifies it. But of course, what the notes are saying, the different directions of the harmonies, the progression, the sort of harmonic direction, story, struggle, and very often triumph, is something that people can also experience and follow that argument in the way that they do in art music, but with that underlying security of knowing that they're locked in to the groove.
I got rhythm.
It's better. I think you could be louder.
I have some pieces that are you know, I call them my trickster pieces like Fearful Symmetries, which is basically a 25-minute long boogie-woogie. You know, we have these styles of American sort of outrageous, over-the-top humor. A little coarse, a little vulgar, and yet at the same time they're full of life.